The sun had only just begun to burn off the morning haze when the street in Willow Creek slowly came alive. It was the kind of neighborhood where every lawn looked manicured, every hedge trimmed at the same height, and every driveway was free of oil stains. The houses, lined up in perfect rows, seemed almost identical at first glance, their pastel siding and brick accents designed to match the uniformity demanded by the Homeowners Association. From the outside, it was the picture of order, safety, and the promise of suburban life. But behind that neat picture, tension always lingered, unspoken rules, silent glares, and the feeling that one misstep could unravel everything. At number 47, a house with cream-colored walls and blue shutters stood quietly, the curtains in the front room still drawn. Inside, life carried on as normal. The woman who lived there was proud of her home. She had saved for years, fought through setbacks that many of her neighbors would never understand, and finally bought a place she could call her own. For her, the house wasn't just walls and windows. It was a mark of survival, of independence, of proving something not just to the world, but to herself. Each picture frame hanging on the wall, each plant she kept alive on the porch, told a story of hard work and quiet victories. To her, this house meant peace. Across the street, peace was the last thing on someone's mind. Karen Mitchell, one of the long-time residents of Willow Creek, had made it her business to know everyone's schedule, everyone's habits, and everyone's flaws. She wasn't the official president of the HOA, though she often acted like she was. If a trash can was left out too long after collection day, she noticed. If the grass grew half an inch past regulation height, she complained. To outsiders, her energy might have seemed impressive. To those who lived under her watchful eye, it was suffocating. She carried herself with authority, the kind of authority no one had given her, but she had claimed anyway. And when Karen claimed something, she rarely let go. The first time Karen noticed the new homeowner across the street, she stood at her window, coffee cup in hand, lips pursed in disapproval. She noticed the moving truck, the laughter between friends helping carry boxes, and the way her new neighbor smiled despite the heavy lifting. It was joy, real, unguarded joy, that irritated Karen in ways she couldn't explain. She had lived in Willow Creek for years, but she never quite felt joy here. Control, yes. Power, but never joy. And there was something about watching someone else feel it that stirred something bitter inside her. On the surface, nothing seemed wrong. People walked their dogs, waved half-heartedly to one another, and watered their flower beds. But beneath the polite smiles, subtle cracks ran through the neighborhood. For all its neatness, Willow Creek was a place where appearances were everything. Some residents had secrets hidden behind those painted doors. Marriages falling apart, debts they couldn't pay, children struggling under the weight of expectations. It was a neighborhood that demanded perfection while quietly rotting from within. And into this fragile balance stepped a woman who didn't fit the mold, at least not in Karen's eyes. For weeks, small things happened that didn't seem connected at first. A note left on the door reminded her of trash day, though she had already placed the bins neatly at the curb. A neighbor who suddenly stopped making eye contact, though they had spoken warmly before. Little whispers told her to be quiet when she walked into the room. It was subtle, but it was real. And while most people in Willow Creek knew better than to cross Karen, the new homeowner wasn't one to bow her head quietly. Still, in those early weeks, life carried on as though nothing was wrong. Inside the house, mornings began with music playing softly in the kitchen as coffee brewed. Workdays stretched long, but there was comfort in coming home to a space that felt safe. Friends visited on weekends, their laughter echoing late into the night. For a time, it felt like the neighborhood's shadows couldn't reach her, but the truth was, the shadows had already noticed her. The line between what was normal and what was dangerous in Willow Creek was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. Most people pretended not to see it, believing that silence was safer than standing up. But silence had a cost, and soon enough, That cost would fall on the woman at number 47. Because while she belied that her house was her sanctuary, someone else across the street believed it was her right to control it. And when those two beliefs clashed, the fragile peace of Willow Creek would shatter in ways no one could ignore. Even in those calm beginnings, some moments hinted at what was to come. The way Karen's car slowed down each time it passed the driveway. The way her eyes lingered on the porch plants as though they were an offense to the neighborhood's standards. The way her smile never reached her eyes when she offered forced greetings. These were small things, but together they were a warning, though no one wanted to see it yet. The neighborhood was built on a promise of security, but security was always fragile when it rested on control. And in Willow Creek, control belonged to Karen, or so she thought. What began as a quiet life in a dream home was already standing on shaky ground, ready to crumble under the weight of someone else's obsession with power. The stage was set, and the players were already in place. All it would take was one confrontation to turn the ordinary into something unbelievable. At first, the tension came quietly, disguised as politeness. Karen showed up at the woman's door with a forced smile and a folder clutched under her arm. She introduced herself as one of the people who help keep this neighborhood in shape. She handed over a packet filled with the HOA's rules, printed, highlighted and underlined as if the woman had never seen them. The new homeowner accepted it with a polite nod, though she already had the same folder tucked away in her kitchen drawer. Karen's smile lingered too long, her eyes scanning the living room behind the door, as though she had a right to judge what she saw. It was a small encounter, but the weight of it lingered long after Karen walked away. Within a week, the first complaint arrived. It wasn't formal, just a note slipped into the mailbox, typed in bold letters. Porch plants must be arranged neatly and kept uniform with the neighborhood standards. It was signed only HOA. The plants in question, 2 flowering pots of vibras, and marigolds and a lavender bush, were healthy, bright, and well kept. They were also different from the rows of roses and hydrangeas that every other house on the block seemed to favor. The message was clear. Difference wasn't welcome. The woman ignored it at first. She told herself it was nothing, that she had done nothing wrong. But as days turned into weeks, the notes kept coming. A warning about the trash cans being too close to the curb. Another about a car parked too long in the driveway when friends visited. Each note felt like an attempt to chip away at her place in the neighborhood, to remind her she didn't belong. Behind those notes was Karen, though she never admitted it outright. She would wave from her front yard, her expression pleasant enough, but there was always a sharpness behind her words. "We have to keep this neighborhood looking a certain way," she said once, as though the woman's home was already a blemish on the block. "It's not personal." But of course it was. The tension grew sharper when a neighborhood block party was announced. It was tradition. Each summer, the residents gathered in the cul-de-sac, setting up tables of food and folding chairs under string lights. It was supposed to be a way to build community, but this time, the air was thick with quiet judgment. When the woman arrived, carrying a tray of homemade peach cobbler, she felt the weight of eyes on her. Conversations hushed when she passed, then resumed in murmurs. A few people greeted her warmly, but most followed Karen's lead, polite nods, stiff smiles, a kind of watchful distance. Karen stood near the grill, chatting loudly with a group of neighbors, her laughter exaggerated, her presence dominating. When she caught sight of the cobbler, she arched an eyebrow. "That looks interesting," she said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. Others chuckled softly, as though on Sia. "Yui." It was subtle, but it was enough to remind the woman she was being measured against an invisible scale. Even in those calm beginnings, some moments hinted at what was to come. The way Karen's car slowed down each time it passed the driveway. The way her eyes lingered on the porch plants as though they were an offense to the neighborhood's standards. the way her smile never reached her eyes when she offered forced greetings. These were small things, but together they were a warning, though no one wanted to see it yet. The neighborhood was built on a promise of security, but security was always fragile when it rested on control. And in Willow Creek, control belonged to Karen, or so she thought. What began as a quiet life in a dream home was already standing on shaky ground, ready to crumble under the weight of someone else's obsession with power. The stage was set, and the players were already in place. All it would take was one confrontation to turn the ordinary into something unbelievable. At first, the tension came quietly, disguised as politeness. Karen showed up at the woman's door with a forced smile and a folder clutched under her arm. She introduced herself as one of the people who help keep this neighborhood in shape. She handed over a packet filled with the HOA's rules, printed, highlighted and underlined as if the woman had never seen them. The new homeowner accepted it with a polite nod, though she already had the same folder tucked away in her kitchen drawer. Karen's smile lingered too long, her eyes scanning the living room behind the door, as though she had a right to judge what she saw. It was a small encounter, but the weight of it lingered long after Karen walked away. Within a week, the first complaint arrived. It wasn't formal, just a note slipped into the mailbox, typed in bold letters. Porch plants must be arranged neatly and kept uniform with the neighborhood standards. It was signed only HOA. The plants in question, 2 flowering pots of vibras, and marigolds and a lavender bush, were healthy, bright, and well kept. They were also different from the rows of roses and hydrangeas that every other house on the block seemed to favor. The message was clear. Difference wasn't welcome. The woman ignored it at first. She told herself it was nothing, that she had done nothing wrong. But as days turned into weeks, the notes kept coming. A warning about the trash cans being too close to the curb. Another about a car parked too long in the driveway when friends visited. Each note felt like an attempt to chip away at her place in the neighborhood, to remind her she didn't belong. Behind those notes was Karen, though she never admitted it outright. She would wave from her front yard, her expression pleasant enough, but there was always a sharpness behind her words. "We have to keep this neighborhood looking a certain way," she said once, as though the woman's home was already a blemish on the block. "It's not personal." But of course it was. The tension grew sharper when a neighborhood block party was announced. It was tradition. Each summer, the residents gathered in the cul-de-sac, setting up tables of food and folding chairs under string lights. It was supposed to be a way to build community, but this time, the air was thick with quiet judgment. When the woman arrived, carrying a tray of homemade peach cobbler, she felt the weight of eyes on her. Conversations hushed when she passed, then resumed in murmurs. A few people greeted her warmly, but most followed Karen's lead, polite nods, stiff smiles, a kind of watchful distance. Karen stood near the grill, chatting loudly with a group of neighbors, her laughter exaggerated, her presence dominating. When she caught sight of the cobbler, she arched an eyebrow. "That looks interesting," she said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. Others chuckled softly, as though on Sia. Yui. It was subtle, but it was enough to remind the woman she was being measured against an invisible scale. Still, she tried to brush it off. She told herself that small-mindedness was their problem, not hers. But things were about to shift from subtle hostility to open conflict. One late evening, as she was locking her front door, she noticed Karen's car idling across the street. The headlights were off, but she could see the shape of Karen behind the wheel, staring. When their eyes met, the car pulled away slowly, as if nothing had happened. It sent a chill down her spine. Karen, meanwhile, was feeding her obsession in ways no one saw. She had convinced herself she wasn't just keeping order. She was protecting the neighborhood from someone she viewed as an outsider. Her own life, behind closed doors, was less perfect than she pretended. Her marriage was cold, her children distant, and the only place she felt in control was out on the street, dictating what others could or couldn't do. She clung to that control because without it, she felt small, invisible. Watching the woman across the street live with joy and independence only deepened her resentment. The notes escalated into official letters, stamped with the HOA's letterhead. Karen had pushed the association into sending them, citing multiple violations. None of them was real, but on paper they carried weight. The woman responded firmly, challenging the claims, refusing to bend. That resistance infuriated Karen more than anything. Most people eventually gave in to her pressure, but this one didn't. Tension turned into confrontation one Saturday morning. The woman was in her yard, trimming her lavender bush, when Karen walked up without invitation. "We need to talk," she said flatly. She listed off supposed violations, her voice rising with each word. The woman stood her ground. "My house is mine. My yard is mine. I'm not breaking any rules." Karen's face hardened, her mask slipping. For the first time, her hostility was naked, no longer covered by polite words. The exchange ended with Karen storming off, muttering loud enough for others to hear. "This neighborhood has standards. Maybe some people just don't belong here." Whispers spread faster after that. Some neighbors sided quietly with the woman, tired of Karen's tyranny, but too afraid to say it aloud. Others avoided eye contact, unwilling to be caught in the middle. The woman felt the walls closing in, her home no longer the sanctuary it once was. She double-checked her locks at night, kept her curtains drawn tighter, and avoided walking outside when Karen was near. Karen, on the other hand, began to unravel in ways even she didn't fully understand. She started keeping a notebook, logging every movement across the street. What time the lights turned off, how many cars came by, and how long the woman's friends stayed. It wasn't just control anymore. It was fixation. Her identity had fused with her mission to push the woman out. In her mind, it was righteous work, protecting her world from someone who didn't belong. But beneath that obsession were cracks in Karen's own life that no one talked about. Her husband had grown tired of her controlling nature, avoided her as much as possible. Her finances were tight, though she hid it well, shopping on credit to keep up the image of perfection. At night, alone in her kitchen, she poured herself glass after glass of wine, staring out the window at the house across the street. Envy mixed with hatred, a cocktail strong enough to cloud reason. The woman across the street had her struggles, though she carried them quietly. Work was demanding, money was stretched thinner than she wanted to admit, and being one of the only black homeowners in the neighborhood came with unspoken pressure. She felt eyes on her everywhere she went, always needing to prove herself, always needing to be better, just to be seen as an equal. The hostility from Karen wasn't just about plants or trash cans. It carried something heavier, something uglier. And she felt it with every word, every look, every note left on her door. The breaking point drew closer with each encounter. One afternoon, the woman returned home to find a notice taped across her front door in bright red letters. Final warning: failure to comply will result in fines or further action. Her hands shook as she tore it down. She knew it wasn't about fines or rules. It was about power. She stormed across the street, knocking hard on Karen's door. When it opened, Karen's smile was thin and sharp. "You need to stop," the woman said, her voice steady despite the anger burning inside her. "This is harassment." Karen leaned against the doorframe, unfazed. "No, this is an order. If you can't handle the rules, maybe you should reconsider living here." The air between them was electric, thick with years of unspoken battles, of race, class, power and control. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, watching but saying nothing. Two women stood locked in a silent war that the rest of the street pretended not to see. From that moment on, the neighborhood was no longer quiet. Every interaction felt charged, every glance a challenge. The woman felt her sanctuary slipping further away, while Karen fed on the conflict like fuel. Neither was willing to back down, and the fragile mask of suburban peace was cracking wide open. What had begun as petty notes and fake smiles had turned into a storm ready to break. And everyone in Willow Creek knew that when it did, the outcome would be anything but ordinary. The night it happened was unusually still, the kind of silence that makes every sound echo louder than it should. The air was heavy, humid, clinging to the skin, and not a single breeze moved the trees lining Willow Creek. Porch lights glowed faintly along the street, but most windows were dark, the neighborhood tucked into its illusion of safety. Across the street, though, two houses remained awake, two women standing on opposite sides of an invisible war, both convinced they were right, both unwilling to back down. It began with a knock, not a gentle one, but hard, impatient, the kind that rattles the doorframe. The woman inside number 47 froze for a moment, her hand tightening around the dish towel she had been holding. She knew who it was before she even opened the door. She could feel the presence, the anger pressing against her walls like heat. When she pulled the door open, there stood Karen, her face lit by the porch light, her jaw tight, eyes burning with something beyond simple annoyance. "You need to step outside," Karen said sharply. Her voice carried across the quiet street, sharp enough to cut through the silence. The woman shook her head. "It's late. Whatever this is, it can wait." But Karen stepped closer, invading the doorway. Her hand braced against the frame as though she had a right to enter. "No, it can't wait. You've ignored every warning. You think the rules don't apply to you, and it ends tonight." Inside, the woman's chest tightened. She had endured months of notes, stares, and whispers, and now Karen was at her doorstep like an executioner. Something inside her snapped. She stepped forward, closing the space between them. "This is my house. You don't get to tell me what to do in my own home." Her voice shook, not from fear but from rage she had kept bottled for too long. The argument erupted there, on the doorstep, voices rising louder and louder until lights flicked on in neighboring houses. Curtains shifted as eyes peered out, but no one intervened. Karen's voice was shrill, accusing, dripping with venom about rules, standards, and how people like you ruined neighborhoods. The woman's hands clenched at her sides, every muscle tight as she tried to keep control. But Karen wasn't stopping. She leaned closer, her finger jabbing in the air, her words cutting deeper and deeper, until they no longer sounded like rules, but like hate, raw and unfiltered. Then it happened. It wasn't planned. It wasn't thought out. It was heat, rage, humiliation boiling over into action. The woman shoved Karen back, her body moving before her mind could catch up. Karen stumbled, her foot catching the edge of the porch step. The sound of her body hitting the ground was sharp, final, like something snapping in the night. For a moment, time froze. The woman stood there, breath heavy, hands trembling, her heart pounding in her ears. Karen lay at the bottom of the steps, unmoving, the porch light casting her shadow long across the concrete. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then a low groan broke it, Karen's body twisting slightly, her hand reaching weird, clay toward the air. Panic surged through the woman. She rushed down the steps, kneeling beside Karen. Her neighbor's face was pale, her breath shallow, her eyes filled with shock and rage, even now. Blood trickled from the side of her head where it had struck the edge of the walkway. "I didn't mean—" The woman's words tumbled out, frantic, desperate. "Karen, I didn't mean to—" But Karen's lips moved, forming words that came out broken and weak. "You'll regret this." Neighbors had gathered by then, standing in clusters at the edge of their yards, whispering, watching. No one came forward to help. No one called out. The woman felt their eyes like knives on her back as she pressed her hands to Karen's wound, trying to stop the bleeding, trying to undo what had just happened. Her mind was a storm, guilt crashing against anger, fear tearing through shock. She thought of calling an ambulance, but part of her hesitated, knowing that every word would be twisted against her. She thought of leaving, running inside and pretending she hadn't opened the door at all, but Karen's ragged breaths tethered her to the ground. Then came the sirens. Someone must have called. The red and blue lights cut through the night, washing over the houses, the trees, the crowd of silent neighbors. The woman stood, her hands stained, her face wet with tears she hadn't realized were falling. Officers rushed forward, voices firm, questions sharp, but all she could do was point at Karen on the ground and whisper, "She wouldn't stop. She wouldn't leave me alone." Karen was lifted onto a stretcher, her body limp, her face ghostly in the flashing lights. She was still alive, but barely, her breath shallow, her pulse weak. The woman watched as they carried her away, her chest caving in with the weight of what had just unfolded. The street was no longer silent. Neighbors murmured in clusters, their faces a mix of shock, judgment, and something else. Relief, perhaps, that the chaos wasn't theirs to carry. Yet not one of them stepped forward to say they had seen the months of harassment, the endless notes, the late-night staring from a parked car. They stood back, safe in their silence, while the woman's world collapsed in front of them. Inside the patrol car, as she sat trembling, the weight of the moment settled on her. She replayed it again and again, the shove, the fall, the sound of bone against concrete. Her mind tried to twist it into an accident, something out of her control, but the guilt pressed harder. She had pushed. She had snapped. And even if she hadn't meant to, the result was still the same. Karen, for all her cruelty, for all her obsession, now lay at the edge of death. And the woman who only wanted peace in her own home was left staring at the wreckage of a life unraveled by one night, one push, one moment, where anger took the reins. The crime wasn't a plan. It wasn't plotted. It was born out of fire, humiliation, and the crushing weight of months of torment. But in that quiet, controlled neighborhood, where everything had to look perfect, the mask was finally ripped away, and what was left was chaos, blood, and the sound of sirens echoing against manicured lawns. The woman closed her eyes as the car pulled away, knowing there was no going back. In Willow Creek, perfection had shattered, and the crime that unfolded would haunt them all. The night after the crime, Willow Creek no longer felt like the same neighborhood. The silence that usually wrapped the cul-de-sac had turned heavy, like a blanket no one could shake off. Porch lights burned late into the night as people stayed awake, whispering behind curtains, piecing together what they thought they had seen. By morning, the story had already twisted into something bigger than the shove, the fall, the blood on the concrete. It became gossip, fuel for judgment, and the woman at number 47 was at the center of it all. She didn't sleep that night. The sound of Karen's body hitting the walkway replayed over and over in her head, louder than the sirens, sharper than the officer's questions. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking, stained in memory even after she had scrubbed them raw. She sat alone in the holding cell, the walls closing in, her heart hammering against the silence. Guilt tore at her, but so did a stubborn anger that refused to quiet. She hadn't gone looking for this fight. She hadn't wanted it. But it had been forced into her life until there was nowhere else for the rage to go. Karen survived the fall, but barely. She lay in the hospital, unconscious, her skull fractured, her body bruised. Tubes and wires kept her alive, machines beeping steadily as her family gathered around her bed. Her husband, who had long grown tired of her controlling ways, now sat at her side, torn between duty and exhaustion. Her children, distant for years, stood there awkwardly, unsure of how to grieve for a mother who had been more tyrant than comfort. Still, seeing her frail and broken stirred something undeniable in them. Fear, sadness, and the dawning truth that power and control couldn't shield her from consequences. News of the confrontation spread quickly, first through the neighborhood, then into the wider community. By the second day, headlines appeared online. HOA dispute turns violent in Willow Creek. Neighbors who had hidden behind closed doors now found themselves speaking to reporters, some painting Karen as a protector of order, others as a bully who finally pushed too far. The woman was portrayed in two extremes, either as a victim of harassment who snapped under pressure, or as a dangerous neighbor who resorted to violence. The truth lay somewhere in between, but the court of public opinion didn't care for nuance. The woman's friends were split. Some stood firmly by her, reminding anyone who would listen of the notes, the threats, the long months of intimidation. Others kept their distance, unwilling to get dragged into a storm that could taint their own reputations. At work, whispers followed her name, supervisors questioning whether she was stable, whether she could be trusted in her position. What she had built carefully for years, her image of strength, independence, resilience, was unraveling with every passing hour. Inside herself, the struggle was worse. She swung between grief and rage, self-blame and defiance. At times, she told herself it was an accident, that Karen had fallen, that she hadn't meant for it to happen. But late at night, when her chest tightened and her breath came sharp and shallow, she admitted the truth she couldn't say out loud. She had pushed. She had lost control. And that one moment had rewritten everything. For Karen, unconscious in the hospital, her reputation was being rewritten too. The neighbors who once cowered under her watchful eye now spoke more freely. They told stories of the countless times she had embarrassed them, fined them, humiliated them. They admitted that they had been too afraid to speak up. Yet, now that she was lying broken and silent, some softened their words, guilt creeping in. It was easier to condemn her while she stood tall. It was harder to kick her when she was down. Her family carried their own shame. They had suffered privately for years, hidden behind the perfect image she forced onto them. Now, their grief was tangled with relief, though none dared admit it aloud. The public saw them as victims, but inside the hospital waiting room, they whispered about how exhausting it had been to live with her iron grip, how this accident had laid bare truths they'd buried for too long. In the wider community, the story became about more than two women. It became about race, class, and control. Commentators online argued that the woman's identity as a black homeowner in a mostly white neighborhood had shaped the entire conflict. Some called it harassment, fueled by prejudice disguised as rules. Others denied race had anything to do with it, insisting it was only about the HOA. The debate raged louder than the voices of the women themselves, turning their private war into a public spectacle. Back in Willow Creek, the atmosphere shifted. Neighbors who had always bowed to Karen's authority now walked with lighter steps, as though her absence had lifted something heavy. But the relief was mixed with fear. They had witnessed how quickly civility had crumbled, how easily order could turn into violence. Parents pulled their children inside sooner. Doors were locked earlier. Conversations were hushed, the community fractured by the knowledge that the picturesque, perfect neighborhood was never as safe as it seemed. For the woman at number 47, the legal consequences loomed like a storm on the horizon. Charged with assault, she faced hearings, lawyers, and the cold, sterile air of the courtroom. Each time she entered, she felt eyes on her, some filled with sympathy, others with condemnation. She tried to hold her head high, but the weight of the whispers, the headlines, and the stares pressed hard against her. Her defense rested not just on facts, but on her truth, that she had been harassed, cornered, pushed until she snapped. But truth in court was never simple. Karen's injuries spoke louder than any testimony, and the image of the shove, repeated in the neighbors' retellings, painted her as the aggressor. Her only weapon was honesty, raw and painful. "I didn't mean to hurt her," she told the judge, her voice breaking. But she wouldn't stop. "I was scared. I was angry. And I lost control." The aftermath wasn't just in the courts or the newspapers. It lived inside her every day. She couldn't look at her porch without seeing Karen's body lying there, the blood against the concrete. She couldn't walk down her driveway without feeling the weight of the neighbors' eyes, measuring, judging, remembering. Her home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison, filled with echoes of that night. In the end, no one walked away unscarred. Karen's body carried the physical cost, her family carried the weight of her legacy, and the woman carried the crushing burden of guilt and shame. Willow Creek itself was left fractured, its polished image permanently cracked. The crime had started as a moment of fury, but its aftermath spread wider than either woman could have imagined. It reached into homes, into hearts, into the stories people told themselves about safety, about community, about who belonged and who didn't. And in that aftermath, the truth hung heavy over them all. One night had changed everything, and nothing would ever be the same again. In the days that followed, Willow Creek carried the weight of the crime like a bruise that couldn't be hidden. The manicured lawns and trimmed hedges looked the same, but the quiet was different now, thicker, more uneasy, as if the whole neighborhood was waiting for something to break again. The crime had left behind more than broken bones and flashing sirens. It had ripped open truths everyone had tried to ignore, and the aftermath refused to be swept away. The woman at number 47 sat in her home on bail, the walls closing in tighter than they ever had before. What was once her dream, her sanctuary, now felt tainted. Every corner reminded her of that night, the sharp crack of Karen's fall, the smear of blood on concrete, the sound of her own voice yelling words she could never take back. She tried to tell herself it was an accident, that she hadn't meant to do it. She even whispered it into the dark when sleep wouldn't come. "I didn't mean it. I didn't mean it." But the image replayed anyway, and with it came the heavy truth. Her hands had done it. Her shove had changed everything. Denial slipped into guilt. Guilt shifted into anger, and anger back into guilt again. Some days she blamed Karen entirely, replaying all the montage, as of notes, harassment, and intimidation. She told herself that anyone would have snapped under the weight of it. Other days she turned the blame inward, wondering if she should have walked away, called the police sooner, or ignored the pounding on her door that night. The cycle consumed her, leaving her raw, sleepless, and haunted. For Karen, the aftermath was a quieter one, but no less painful. She lay in a hospital bed, weeks stretching into a blur of machines and half-conscious murmurs. She survived, but the damage was lasting. Her sharp voice, once so commanding, had dulled, her words slurring as she fought to piece them together. Her family visited, though their faces carried more exhaustion than warmth. Her husband sat silently by her side, flipping through his phone more than he looked at her. Her children came out of duty, their visits brief, their voices stiff with the kind of love that had always been demanded but never nurtured. For all her control and power in Willow Creek, Karen had ended up powerless, reduced to frailty in a way that unsettled everyone who had once feared her. The community's reaction was complicated. At first, neighbors whispered in shock, their voices filled with outrage. To some, the woman at number 47 was a danger, a violent presence who didn't respect rules. To others, she was a victim who had been pushed too far, someone who carried the weight of Karen's cruelty for the entire street. Conversations turned cautious, fragmented, people choosing sides quietly but never saying too much aloud. Most avoided her entirely, walking past her house with quick steps, their eyes fixed on the pavement. The media made it worse. News stories painted the scene in bold strokes. HOA leader hospitalized after violent confrontation, and suburban dispute turns to assault. The woman's face was splashed across articles, her name debated in comment sections, her life dissected by strangers who knew nothing about the months of torment that led to the shove. Some defended her online, pointing to the racial undertones, the history of discrimination faced by black homeowners in such neighborhoods. Others condemned her, calling her unstable, dangerous, unfit to live among peaceful families. Each headline carved deeper into her isolation. Karen's reputation also began to be split. In public memory, she became two different people. The woman who kept the neighborhood in order, and the bully who finally went too far. Stories of her strictness surfaced in interviews, neighbors describing how she fined them for trivial things, how she humiliated them over landscaping or parking. For some, it was a relief to finally say out loud what they had endured under her authority. For others, it was uncomfortable, like betraying the very person they once obeyed. Inside the woman's own circle, the ripple spread far. Friends grew cautious about visiting her house, afraid of being dragged into the scandal. At work, colleagues avoided her in the break room, their voices dropping when she entered. Her career, something she had fought so hard to build, now seemed fragile, shadowed by her arrest record and the stigma attached to it. She felt herself shrinking into the cracks of her own life, no longer sure of where she belonged. And yet, beneath the fear and the judgment, a quieter truth stirred. Some neighbors admitted in hushed voices that they had seen Karen's cruelty long before that night. They had watched her patrol the street, had received her notes, had felt her eyes burning through curtain. They had stayed silent because silence was easier. Now they carried their own guilt, that their silence had allowed it to escalate, that maybe if they had spoken up sooner, none of this would have happened. Karen's family wrestled with guilt too, though theirs was heavier and more personal. Her husband, who had long resented her dominance, now questioned whether his passivity had fueled her behavior. Her children, who had distanced themselves for years, now faced the weight of unfinished conversations, of love never spoken, of apologies never made. They mourned not just the injury, but the woman she might have been if control hadn't consumed her. The legal process was slow, dragging everyone through hearings and testimonies. Each time the woman sat in court, her chest tightened as lawyers argued over her intent, her character, her life. She listened as Karen's family painted her as violent, as neighbors testified with half-truths, as her own defense fought to show the harassment she endured. It wasn't just about the shove anymore. It was about who she was, about her right to exist in a place that had tried so hard to reject her. The weight of it all settled differently on everyone involved. For the woman, it was a cage of shame and guilt she couldn't escape. For Karen, it was the loss of the one thing she had built her identity on: control. For the neighborhood, it was a mirror held up to their silence, their complicity, their comfort in letting one woman terrorize another until violence was inevitable. As weeks turned into months, Willow Creek never fully healed. The story lingered in every whispered conversation, every glance at number 47, every awkward silence when Karen's name was mentioned. The illusion of perfection had been shattered, and in its place was the reminder that beneath the trimmed hedges and painted shutters, people carried secrets, bitterness, and hate, sharp enough to cut. The crime had left scars deeper than the wound on Karen's head or the charges against the woman. It had exposed the fragility of their world, the danger of silence, and the cost of letting power go unchecked. And in that fragile, fractured neighborhood, no one could escape the truth. They had all played a part in what happened, and the consequences would haunt them long after the sirens faded.